Greetings. My name is Kathleen Lane, and I'm here today with Rebecca Sherrod. We're both at the University of Kansas, and we're very appreciative of your time in coming to have this conversation about systematic screening. This work is, of course, focused on the work of the Center for Positive Behavior Intervention and Support, and Rebecca and I are really honored to have a subcontract where we get to focus exclusively on systematic screening. So as we jump in today, what we are going to do is we're going to take a moment to explore systematic screening, what it is, talk about how that works within a tiered system. And then we're going to talk about 3 different ways that screening data can be used. Specifically, we're going to talk about how to use those data to really think about your entire system. So these data are not just about collecting information to connect kids to supports. We really want to use these data in conjunction with other data collected as part of regular school practices to think about, what do we need to shift at the system level? What do we need to do to empower teachers to really maximize engagement, decrease disruption, and really create joyful learning environments for students? And then we're also going to talk, about how to use those data to make a reliable, accurate detection as to who might need more than Tier 1 has to offer. And then lastly, and this we're very excited about, we're going to connect you with a host of resources that are all free access available on pbs.org, as well as ci3t.org, that you can jump off with and use so that you can get started with systematic screening. And as you do this, we are also going to give you some points of conversations for you to continue your learning and maybe take this back with a learning partner, exploring it with your faculty and staff. But before we get started, I really want to say thank you very much to the Center for creating this opportunity. The rigor and the reach with which they shape school practices cannot be understated, and it's a true honor. Rebecca and I are honored to be a part of this. So let's go ahead and jump in. And to the extent that you feel comfortable doing so, feel free to open up your chat. You'll be able to communicate directly with Rebecca and myself. And if you feel comfortable saying your name and where you're from, we'd love to see who's on with us. And I know many of you will be using this recording at a later date. So please, by all means, feel free to reach out. At the very end, we'll give you our direct email contact so that we can follow up if you have any questions or would like to connect afterwards. So thank you, Katie Austin. I appreciate it. I'm so glad to see people here. We've got some people coming in from Florida and Kansas. So thank you very much for the gift of your time. Many of you have heard me say this a million times, but I really honestly think each other's times is the biggest gift we can give each other. So first of all, thank you. Thank you so much for being here, literally from coast to coast. We've got people coming in from New York as well. But we want to thank you for really thinking about students' well-being right now. And as we take a breath, take a moment to be present. When we think about even before the pandemic started, we had a lot of students in the United States of America that were really struggling with both major challenges of childhood, specifically internalizing, shy, anxious, and withdrawn, as well as acting out issues. And if you were to have taken a picture prior to the pandemic, in that picture of the United States, you would have found that you've got about 12% of all school-age youth that have some form of moderate to severe challenging behaviors. And of those behaviors, some of them are indeed acting out. They're non-compliance, it's disruption, things that really impede the instruction and the positivity in a classroom. Also present are things that show up maybe are a little bit harder to detect. Kids with internalizing issues, shy, anxious, and withdrawn. And the challenge of that is that oftentimes it's kids with acting out issues that are most quick to capture attention as teachers. And so sometimes kids with internalizing issues can go overlooked. And as you look at those Venn diagram, you'll see that those overlap. So there are some kids, there's about the correlation coefficient is 0.51, which means 25% in common, that we've got some kids that have both. And so we need this information as educators so that we can think about how kids are doing. And it is also true that it's expected that these numbers have increased dramatically as we've navigated through the pandemic. So I appreciate you being here because I think oftentimes it was a really misunderstood thing. And a lot of people used to think that, oh, kids with challenging behaviors, they're going to get referred, they're going to get tested, they're going to get placed elsewhere, they're going to go into special education. And the fact of the matter is, less than 1% of all school-age youth go on to receive special education services for under the category of emotional disturbances. So that means the vast majority of our students are going to be supported within the general education community. So thank goodness that we've got tiered systems in place so that we can have a plan that embraces the systemic approach to not only preventing learning and behavior and social and emotional well-being challenges from occurring, but then responding efficiently and effectively when they do occur. So as we get started today, as I mentioned, we're going to start by talking about systematic screening in tiered systems. And I want to emphasize, we want to have a plan before you screen. So we hope you are excited to learn about systematic screening. We know some of you are probably already doing it already, and some of you are exploring it for the first time. But the big deal is, if you want to screen, have a plan to intervene before you get started. And so today, what we're going to be talking about is some of our work specifically focused on comprehensive, integrated, three-tiered models of prevention. And this is one integrated approach to tiered systems. It was developed in the late 1990s. And it was essentially like a broadening of traditional multi-tiered systems that also built in social and emotional well-being. So it's got academics, it's got behavior, and it's got social and emotional well-being. And the cornerstone, the center of this whole thing is positive behavior interventions and supports. So ideally, within a district, you have a district leadership team. Each school has their own CI3T leadership team, and this becomes the vehicle by which we provide everything for students, how we meet their multiple needs. So when we think about this work, we want to make sure that there's clarity for all the adults and the students and the families so that they know what we are offering, what we are serving to students in terms of how we're going to meet their academic needs. So we're going to clarify, district and state standards. We want to provide high quality, engaging instruction. We want to create clarity so that anybody that's onboarding into a school system knows what's to expect. As I mentioned, at the center of this is positive behavior intervention and supports. And in a CI3T model, we also have this tool called the School-Wide Expectation Survey for specific settings. And it actually allows you to survey all of your faculty and staff, all the adults in the building, to find out, what do you think kids really need to know to be successful in classrooms, in hallways, in non-instructional areas, so that as you build out your expectation matrix, that too is data informed based on input, so that we can make sure all the adults are on the same page as to what's going to get taught, what's going to get practiced, what's going to get acknowledged. So we want to create some clarities on that. In addition, in a CI3T model, there's also a commitment to bringing in validated resources that are used at Tier 1. And you might think about this as like literally leveling the playing field, so that if you've adopted a validated resource, you bring that in, you build an instructional schedule. And it's not just teaching it and crossing off the list, it's actually weaving those things into the daily practices of instruction. And this is important because there's been decades of research to show that this matters. Like, we want to explicitly teach kids things like how to show empathy, how to recognize how their body's feeling, to become self-regulated, lifelong, self-determined learners. And we know that when kids build their social and emotional learning skill sets, they do well in school. We see that they have more positive social interactions with their peers. We see less acting out issues. We see more academic success, and that's important as we're navigating learning loss. So when we think about the base experience that we want to create for students in your building, like at your elementary, your middle, or your high school, we want to think about these priorities of creating clarities of the Tier 1 experience. And rather than having separate teams looking at all these multiple sources of information, we want to create this environment where the adults in the building, which, and I should emphasize, these team members also include a family member, they go through this process of making sure that it's transparent. And as you might imagine, this takes a little bit of time to build your system. This is an example of one district that we had the luxury of partnering with for a number of years. And part of this work was funded by the Institute of Education Sciences as part of a practitioner grant, that they spend an entire year of building out their CI3T model. Like, what is it going to look like? And there's points of input where they're giving feedback to faculty and staff along the way to say, here's our initial ideas. Information is gleaned. It's used to shape revisions. And this is also really good because we've been able to learn there's a tool called the primary intervention rating scale. And as you're going through this building process, we've learned that school site means about what people think about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes actually predicts how well this will get implemented later. So it is a journey. But the end game output is actually each school having a manual that essentially becomes the playbook for everything that we're going to be offering in the schools. We've often said, CI3T isn't one more thing on your plate. It is the plate. And one of our wonderful district partners in the state of Washington took that analogy even further. And she said, the way they talk about it is that this plate contains what they are serving for all students, for some, and for a very few. So if you were to peel back what this plan might look like at the beginning, they're blank blueprinted templates so that you can think about what it is that you want to offer as the clarities, the certainties. And in a time where we have many new adults coming in the building, like people that are brand new to teaching, people that are new to the district, what a gift to be able to create clarities for things like clarifying, here's how we're going to teach reading, here's how we're going to teach math. Like, what do I really need to know when I walk in to be a successful faculty and staff member? And part of it is also creating clarities on what are the very practical, low intensity, teacher delivered strategies that I'm going to use, put into my toolkit, if you will, to maximize engagement and limit disruption. And this builds off the amazing work that's been done by Brandy Simonson and Jen Freeman. Things like, higher rates of behavior-specific praise, building and instructional choices, increasing opportunities to respond. And those get clarified in terms of academics, because if we're going to ask people to engage in, 90 minutes of uninterrupted English and language arts learning or block scheduling at a middle or high school, teachers are going to need to have those strategies in hand. And in addition to teaching expectations through those expectation matrices that I'm confident many of you have posted in your hallways and your classrooms and in restrooms, in addition to that, we also want to have a very respectful way to respond when challenging behavior does come up. That would ideally be a tier 1 practice. And ideally, we would want to make sure, I've heard Tim Lewis say it a million times, if you could teach one thing to every student and make sure it's in every teacher's hands, is that gift of showing empathy. So when challenges are happening, rather than asking them to stop doing it, seek to understand first, show empathy, keep instruction moving forward, acknowledge kids that are meeting expectations, offer redirections. But we want teachers to feel fluent and confident and comfortable in knowing what to do, because that can feel scary. Again, you can feel locked up when, behavior feels like things are kind of getting a little bit out of control. Also, as part of those tier 1 practices is clarity on how that validated resource that you brought in to level the playing field for all students in your building. We want to make sure that there's a plan for how those lessons are going to get taught throughout your entire student body. And again, it's not enough just to cross off the lesson after you've taught it. We want to teach this entire thing in an integrated fashion. And once we think about we're going to change the student experience by first changing the adult experience. So we're going to help the adults know how to teach this in an integrated way. In addition to acknowledging the students for their shifts that we're asking for, we're also going to make sure that we're recognizing the adults that are now engaging in this integrated lesson planning. And then finally, we also want to make sure that we're collecting information to see, is this getting in place as planned? What do people think about it? And how are students responding? So that's the point of the academic and the behavior screenings. We want to make sure that we're checking in 3 times a year to see how things are happening. And that's the main focus that we're going to talk about in this next 45 minutes together, but we want to set the stage to know that this is what we're talking about at tier 1. And when we're talking conceptually about integrated lesson plans, we're not suggesting that you go ask people to go write these out tomorrow, but in your mind's eye, be thinking about what a gift it could be to walk into any classroom in your elementary, your middle, your high school, your preschool, and know that from the teacher perspective, we want to communicate what's the academic objective, what is the behavioral thing that I'm going to do to help them maximize engagement, limit disruption. And then I'm also going to remind kids of things like, here's a great opportunity for us to practice that skill that we've talked about, in terms of showing empathy. So it might be if I'm doing a lesson from a chapter on a book like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, you might say, you remember when we talked a little bit about looking for how to resolve conflict in positive, productive ways? when we're doing our small group reading today, we're going to just take a couple minutes to see which characters in the story really did a great job of resolving conflicts and who might benefit from a little bit more support. So we're alerting kids as to these applied practice opportunities. And then to keep kids engaged, we want to know that we can thread these low intensity supports through all phases of instruction, from the anticipatory set to guided practice, independent practices. But we want to make sure that those become the building blocks to which we are creating confidence for teachers. So we've got this system, we're empowering teachers with these low intensity strategies. And ideally, we're checking in fall and in winter to see how are things going in terms of like sociality. What do you think about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes in fall and spring? And making sure this is happening as planned. In CI3T models, they, like in many models, use the tiered fidelity inventory as well as some CI3T specific measures, but we really have to know, is tier 1 in place? Because none of us want to be the person that says a student needs more than tier 1 has to offer if tier 1 is not even certainly in place. So before we start thinking about screening, we want to have this backdrop of clarity on what's happening for all students. And we also want to make sure that we've got a plan to not only communicate, here are the strategies, the practices, and the programs with enough evidence behind them to support kids that need more than tier 1 has to offer. We want to create clarities about how do you use your screening data with other data collected as part of your regular school practices to make those connections both at tier 2 and at tier 3. And an important charge that we all have right now is making sure that in this integrated system that you're building, we want to know what's in place and how people are going to get that professional learning that they need to do this well. So just like we do data-informed decision-making for the adults, we also want to make sure that we're doing data-informed professional learning for the adults in their building. So part of screening is making sure your system is placed. And then we want to make some good decisions about what screening tool to be brought in as part of the screening practices. How are data going to be collected? How is it going to be shared out? How are we going to make sure that we're doing accurate decision making? And that thing about like selecting a tool that makes sense, that is really, really important, because if you're interested in finding both major challenges of childhood, like internalizing and externalizing, then you want a screening tool that's going to pick up those specific constructs. And today we're going to focus mostly on teacher-completed systematic screenings. And these are done 3 times a year, in fall, in winter, and in spring. And these are unlike academic screening in the sense that we're not talking to a child and saying, are you feeling like you're internalizing today? Although I definitely probably have asked my kids that at a breakfast table when they were growing up. But these are teacher-completed, independently completed, following the planned procedures for completing as evidenced in the technical manuals. And one other distinction between academic and behavior screening is that whereas academic screenings can happen as soon as kids come back from summer break, with behavior screenings, you wait 4 to 6 weeks and then complete them so that there's time to settle in. So these are completed fall, winter, and spring. And the purpose of the winter time point between fall and winter, and that winter usually happens right before winter break, is you're looking to see how are kids responding to tier 1. It gives you information on your system as a whole. So today, at the very end, you're going to get this listing of resources. And I want to say this presentation is also available to you on the CI3T website. So Rebecca will put that in the chat for you, as well as the other resources that are there now. And you'll, of course, have this webinar, and we're going to connect you with these resources that you can use to help make decisions about what should we select, how do we install it, and importantly, how do we use the data. But when we're making those decisions about what to bring in, again, be clear on what are you trying to accomplish. Please don't pick something just because it's bright and shiny. Make sure that you're picking something that is, is normed and validated and prioritized based on the value and the culture of your community. So when those decisions are made and it is installed, then we're going to have this way where we can look at it multiple ways, like what's happening at tier 1, what's the magnitude of success or challenge within my system? What do I need in terms of empowering teachers as I unpack it? And then lastly, like how do I use that along with other data to connect kids to these additional supports? And when we talk about multiple sources of data, I want to clear something up. We are not saying have multiple screeners for the same purpose. We're saying use those data, like behavior screening data, along with academic screenings, along with office discipline referrals, along with attendance, along with nurse visits, because it's those collective sets of information that's going to paint the picture. So we'll talk more about this in just a couple minutes, but just to be clear, we want to be able to look for maybe kids that have acting out issues, as well as kids that are also struggling in the area of reading. And together, those pieces of information are going to help inform instruction, because a screener is just a screener. Your blood pressure might be a little bit high, either because you walked up the stairs to go into your doctor's office, you're a little bit nervous about being there, or maybe there's another issue. So this is just one tool. So keeping that in mind, we want to encourage you to think about something that is psychometrically sound, meaning it works well for your intended purpose, and something that is socially valid. Because if a screener is too labor intensive, even if it works super, super well, if it's too cumbersome, too expensive, too time consuming, oftentimes people will not stick with it. So we want to make sure that you're making a good choice. And we also want to make sure you're making a choice that is for the long haul, something that you can sustain, because these are not interchangeable. So you can't swap out screening tools every year and be able to take a look back. We're going to feature just one screening tool today because it is a free access screening tool. It's the Student Risk Screening Scale for internalizing and externalizing behaviors. There's also another funded study by the Institute of Education called Project Screen that Rebecca has been directing for a number of years. We're excited, hopefully this time next year, to share even more information about this. But we want to feature this because we know a lot of people are using this. And again, it is something that is free access. And you are not saying that a kid is each of those things. You're looking to see, do those behaviors occur together and to a high enough degree? And then that information is also used then to essentially place students into one of three groups, either low, moderate, or high risk for either internalizing, so it's the shy, anxious, withdrawn, or externalizing, acting out, non-compliant. And at this point, there are different cut scores, like different groupings for how it works at the middle and high school. And again, if you have another screening tool that you're already using, the logic is the same. But we want to glean that information. And when we keep talking about look at the system as a whole, this is the starting point. These are data from an actual elementary school that's been doing systematic screening since 2014. And this allows decision-making to take place by looking at the school as a whole to see what is the percentage of kids at low, moderate, and high risk. When they first started implementing CI3T in 2014, you can see they had work to do at Tier 1. And that as the years progresses, you see shifts in terms of the percentage of kids that are in the green is generally getting bigger, meaning we have fewer students at low risk. And this is for acting out issues. And I will say, as a mother and as a researcher, I think the importance of looking for kids with internalizing issues cannot be overstated, because they're typically not going to do things that earn office discipline referrals. And if that is your primary mechanism right now for how you're looking for kids that need more than Tier 1 has to offer, we are missing students with internalizing issues. And there's amazing work done by Kent McIntosh and Catherine Bradshaw that will allow you to go deeper about the importance of early detection for kids with internalizing issues. But the gift of systematic screening is it now has a mechanism in place for you to be able to quantify from the teacher perspective how this looks for students. And I will give you a little sneak preview. We have an article under review right now with more than 50,000 students that establishes measurement invariance, which means it's a way to look at measurement bias. And right now we've got preliminary data on that very large sample to show that the scores from this tool work equally well to look for kids that are boys and girls, kids that are Black and kids that are white, kids that are Black and kids that are not, white kids that are white and kids that are not of color, kids that are Hispanic and those that are not, and kids who are receiving special education services and those who are not. So that tool is functioning in a way that we can draw some confidence from those scores. In addition, we want to also peel back, not just to look at the school as a whole, we want to unpackage by grade level to see if there's any pockets of concern or places that we can push in to make system shifts. And one of the things that we're going to want to know for these screening tools is how they work. And one important piece of information about reliability and validity, starting with reliability piece, is we want to make sure that those scores are actually predicting important outcomes. So we have learned, we as a collective field, there's been great work by our research team, by Brian Barger, by Emily Graybill, and others that have shown that those fall scores, like at the elementary level, they predict how kids do at the end of the year. They predict how many office discipline referrals a student's going to earn. They predict the number of suspensions. They predict the number of nurse visits. And it's not that the nurse is a bad person, but the fact that they need to go to the nurse, that's the challenge. And in addition, those fall screening scores also predict how they're doing academically. And the gift of screening is that, like that tool that we're showing you right now, it takes 15 minutes. You build that into your regularly scheduled faculty meetings in fall, in winter, in spring. And those scores, we know, work to predict who is going to have a challenge. So as we're thinking about early warning indicators, if you can put in a screening tool in place, we don't have to wait for kids to have earned those office discipline referrals or to experience on-campus suspension or to miss a lot of school or spend time in the nurse's office. We can use that information to shape instruction. And the same is also true for internalizing issues. And so this is really good news. Teachers are amazingly accurate in terms of the information that they glean. And I want to emphasize there is no decision-making that would take place with those individual items. This tool works by saying, do these behaviors occur together and to a high enough degree? Because it's the co-occurrence of those things that are predicting important outcomes. And in this particular approach at the elementary level, it's one teacher completing that screening for students in their homeroom class. In addition, systematic screening can also be done in middle and high schools. And if you are new to screening in secondary schools, Rebecca and I want to make it really clear up front that you do not have to have every student screened by every teacher every period. So typically in a school, they'll pick one time of day when all students are present in the building. And that's more complicated than it sounds because, like in some high schools, it often is, it's fifth period. It's the period that backs up against lunch is the only time when students are there because some kids might leave early for early career experiences, or they might be doing a bridge class at a local college. But in this case, you want to have one rater that is consistent in terms of time of day. And then these are data actually from 2004. And I want to show you this because I want to emphasize screening is not new. Screening has been around for a long time. And I love and appreciate, the wonderful work that was done and is done by Hill Walker from University of Oregon, the SSBD, Systematic Screening for Behavior Disorder, amazing tool that he and Ed Veal have put together, and Herb Severson, so that you can look for both major challenges of childhood. Tom Drummond was the one that initially built the SRSS that was originally just the first 7 items. And if you look at these data in this graph, you're able to see over time, like in this one middle school, the percentage of kids that are in low, moderate, and high risk over time. And I always feel like when you look at 2008 in this graph, I feel like it's one of those things where I should say results are not typical. It's like those weight loss commercials. You would expect to have more than 1% of the kids showing up as having potentially tier 3 needs. But even this, in the early years of screening, people were skeptical, like, does screenings really work if it's just one teacher, 1 point? But check this out. And these data have long since been published, but we've learned that, like, at that school, like those fall scores, those also predicted how middle school kids it did at the end of the year. So kids that started off here in the low risk category, the moderate and the high risk, while waiting to the end of the year when they're implementing tier 1 practices, we found out that the percentage of kids in the fall, if they were in the low risk category, they earn on average 1.5 office discipline referrals over the course of that year. Kids that start off in the yellow, they earned about 5. These kids that start off at high risk earned about 8. And the same was true for in-school suspension. And then for everybody who feels like, I don't have the bandwidth to think about it, I just got to focus on academics, it even predicted how kids ended the year in terms of a grade point average. So kids that started off the year with greater risk ended the year with lower academic performance, and they even failed more classes. So what a gift that you could ask teachers to come together for 15 minutes one time and have it predict outcomes. And the same has also been studied multiple times now by multiple research teams to show that that works over time. These data are data that were shared with us from a high school principal. And it was like, hey, Kathleen, I know that one of my math teachers mentioned we now have been screening for 3 years, so we can be able to look at trends over time. This is their internalizing behaviors. This is kids at low risk in 2016. 2017, and 2018. And you can see those percentages are getting bigger over time, while the percentage of kids that are screening in moderate risk are decreasing, as well as kids in the high risk category decreasing. So this gives us a way to look at the system. And there's been some wonderful new articles that are coming out right now about looking at screening within the system and using it to shape the system. That is excellent. And we can see that some people have been doing this for a number of years with internalizing and externalizing behavior patterns. And if you have the question on your mind of, well, can they really do it? One teacher, does it still predict important outcomes? And yes, the answer is yes. For middle school and high school, we know that's true. Those fall scores predict how kids do. And in some studies, there's no distinction between students that are at the moderate and high risk range in terms of end of the year outcomes, which means any sign of concern at the beginning is something to pay attention to. And so what a gift that we now have a way to accurately detect who might need more than Tier 1 has to offer, as well as get information to think about shifts that I may need to make within the broader community at Tier 1. And as people are installing and sustaining and using systematic screening, we want to make sure, and that's what we're going to do today, is think about, how do I do this? So like once I have made the decision about which screening tool to bring into my building, how do I use those data to shape instruction? And so as I mentioned, Rebecca and I are going to share 3 ways we can do this. And then we're going to share some resources for you so that regardless of your stage, if you're in the process of selecting, if you're already using it, or you need some more guidance, or you just want to get some examples of success stories from other implementers, we've got that for you. These data are also data from one elementary school in North Carolina. And I have a lot of respect for this principal. The first time they screened, these were their data. And she used this information to say, we're not where we need to be in terms of academics, in terms of reading and behavior and pro-social behavior and motivation to learn. This is the SIS Performance Screening Guide. And the gift of this is, again, it gives you a snapshot. And in this situation, there's a lot of flexibility. At this school, PBIS was not yet in place. They did not have a standard approach for most things. So it was like the Wild West in terms of every classroom having their own classroom management system, multiple acknowledgement systems. And although it was a very small school, this was not working. Those data created that transparency to say, we have some work to do. That's very different than this middle school that we just looked at just a few moments ago, where we can see that over time, that school's really in pretty good shape, and it allows them the bandwidth to focus on other things. There was a man in this school who was the vice principal at the beginning, and then he later became the principal. But when he was a vice principal, after screening got in place and CI3T was underway for a couple of years, I remember him saying, I feel like my job is completely different. And I asked what he meant by that. And he's like, I used to feel like a disciplinarian, where all I do is respond to office discipline referrals. And he said, now I feel like an interventionist. And he was one of the first in the middle schools to, draw down data to say like where kids, attendance and tardiness and course failures and screening. And he was using that data to make decisions about who might need more. That's great. So first thing we talked about is look at the system, see what's happening in terms of Tier 1. The next thing we want to do is we want teachers to be able to have a look at multiple sources of data. And our encouragement to you is make sure that whatever system that you are currently using in your building, that you find a way to work within your system or shift to a system that will allow you to essentially have like a data dashboard. These are fictitious students' names, but pretend like you're a 5th grade teacher or a 7th grade teacher, and these are your kids. This is going to give us that multiple sources of information that we keep talking about, because if I only look at one slice, I only looked at internalizing or only looking at externalizing, I'm missing the complete picture for kids. Because how I would intervene for a child that is high in internalizing, low in reading, and not showing up to school regularly is very different from the kid that is low in reading, lots of internalizing, who is a regular attender. So my first line of defense for the kid that's absent all the time is going to be to get them to school. And then the other situation, if the kid is a regular attender and not making progress, that's a different focus for interventions. But at the onset, if this was your student body, like if this was your class, you're not going to start by putting all these kids in Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. The first thing you're going to think about is, for me as a teacher, What are some of those simple shifts that I can make in how I'm teaching, things that I can build in, like we just saw at the beginning of the CI3T blueprint, like what are those strategies like higher rates of praise, building in, using pre-correction, building in more instructional choices. And so if you would like, on our website, this is all free access and available to you. Each of these blue things is like an accordion. You are welcome to go there and download free access on-demand professional learning resources. And in 18 months from today, we will also have a whole new suite of, more tricked out type of these same strategies, as well as some others that are being funded by Project Enhance, which is one of the integrated tiered systems of support grants that is currently led by Michael Coyne and Brandy Simonson. So, but for right now, you can jump on and take a peek at some of these strategies. And so like if, for example, you were to click on one of those and look at like high probability requests or increasing opportunities to respond, there you would find everything that you would need to do to either go do that in your classroom or teach that to others in your school. But each of these has, explicit list of step-by-step approaches. And in addition, we also have a new special issue coming out in preventing school failure. The entire issue is open access. So Rebecca, for example, led one article on how to do pre-correction in remote and in hybrid learning environments. And there's also guidance for how families can use those same strategies at home. But there you'll find 4 different strategies: pre-correction, active supervision, instructional choice, and behavior-specific praise. And I'm very proud of that special issue because each of those first authors was a former student. And so that's exciting to see how people have innovated on those. So look for those if you're looking for it. And one of the nice things too is the same steps that you'll find on this website are the same steps there. So we can spend a little less time trying to see how things are similar and different and more time focused on implementation. And if you were to peel back some of those offerings, like reading those articles or looking on that website, you're going to see things like little checklists for getting started. You're going to see things like infographics, short little videos. And thanks to talented members of our team like Paloma Perez, we have some of these translated into Spanish to make sure that families other than those that speak English can access these resources. And as I mentioned before about that whole idea of that integrated lesson planning, one of the things that you might want to immediately start baking into all of your professional learning, whether it's 10 minutes at a faculty meeting or part of your district-wide professional learning or your own book study or just something for yourself, is knowing how to do those strategies so that we can focus on creating positive, productive, and engaging learning environments wherever you are. One of the things you might consider doing at this point also is thinking about how to build capacity in your building. Rather than waiting for people to come in to teach these strategies, you might think about having 2 people in your building that could be the go-to people for how to do instructional choice. So they might read that article, that free access or free open access article that was written by Katie Lane and colleagues. They could go read that, drop down these resources on the website, and they could be the go-to people for instructional choice. Then they might go to read one of the articles written by Katie Austin on active supervision. So they could go and read that, and they could drop down and grab these resources and go push that out. So essentially you're building like on-site coaches. And so the benefit of doing those on-site coaches is you're not waiting for outside experts, but you're capitalizing on the talent that you have in your building. So you might think about following this webinar, dedicating 15 minutes to having that conversation with your own professional learning community or people in your building, or if you're technical assistance providers, what could that look like if you decided to focus on those strategies? Because those are like the fundamentals to maximize engagement. Then the third way that we can use those screening data are to connect kids to additional supports beyond Tier 1. And I want to say there are no Tier 2 kids, there are no Tier 3 kids, there are no kids in the bubble. There are kids that might benefit from more than Tier 1 has to offer. And I want to emphasize that back in the day, a lot of people thought, Tier 2 was always small group and Tier 3 was always individual. And I'd like you to think about it in terms of intensity. So this is an example of a CrossFit gym. And if any of you have done CrossFit, go ahead and throw a yes in the chat. And if you haven't, just put no, not yet. But if you're doing CrossFit, I think it's one of the best examples of how you can engage in Tier 2 support. And I remember one of the very first times my daughter, Katie, she's an amazing CrossFitter, an Olympic weightlifter, and she's a coach. But I remember the first time I went into a CrossFit gym with her, And I remember one of the activities was doing like a pull-up on that thing, which is called a rig. Hey, Jason, I'm glad you're there. I'm glad you're enjoying it. So Katie's up there and she can do chest to bars. I go up to that and I'm hanging on that and there's literally no traction. So the coach at the time said, hey, come over here. And then he puts this giant green band. So I get in there and I pull and still nothing's happening. So then he goes and gets another band. Now I've got 2 rubber bands and they're big rubber bands. And it's like a miracle, like my chin's over the bar and I was engaging in that instruction. And I remember the next thing was like jump rope was part of the warm up. And I remember my daughter doing double unders and I'm doing single unders. And I want to mention at the time I was 48 years old and had 2 children. So I'm just going to say that 48, had 2 kids, started with jump rope. And some of you might understand the impact of that. But I got through it. It was like good. Most good moms had big old pair of sweats. So they were dark, thank God. But at the end of that whole time, under the warm up and the little practice drill with the pull-ups, at no point did anybody say to me as a first timer, Kathleen, you couldn't get your chin over the bar or you peed on yourself in the warm up, you got to leave. None of that happened. I was included in that community and I'm still included in that community. And by the way, I still don't have a pull-up, but I don't have 2 bands that I'm using anymore. But the point being, each of those little modifications, the rubber bands, and he could have benefited from a pre-corrective. Hey, anybody that needs to use the restroom before a jump rope, let's do that now. Keep that in mind. But the idea would be we can do these slight increases in terms of support. So think about these as moderate intensity supports. Similarly, like some people could jump up and do burpee box jump over. Some people might be stepping up. But the idea is, yes, Jason, you are so right. I need to work on the kips. I'm going to circle back with me. I'll let you know how I do. But we want to make sure that as educators, we've got the ideas. We've got the scaling, if you will, to keep kids in the classroom included and not marginalized. And so as we think about creating tier 2 supports within a CI3T system, part of what you'll find is these intervention grids for tier 2 and for tier 3. And the intent of these is also to create transparency as to what those extra supports are. Self-monitoring, you would define what we mean by that. And here's the game changer. This is how screening comes into play. Rather than it being like a referral or a teacher referral or nomination, we're literally going to look 3 times a year to see who might benefit from that. So that column specifies the entry criteria to say, kids who meet these entry criteria might benefit from this extra support. So there would be a conversation between a family member, the student, and the teacher to say, this could be a possibility. What do you think? And then anytime we do something extra with the student, we want to do 3 things. We definitely want to progress monitor to know how it's working, but really to know how it's working, you also have to have some treatment integrity information because we've got to know, is that in place? Because if you don't collect information on treatment integrity, it's just like somebody talking about their dating life in high school. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. You got to have the data. And then also importantly, before you start, we need to assess social validity to find out, what do all the people involved think about the goals and the procedures and the outcome? Because if a kid straight up tells you, it would be embarrassing for me to have a self-monitoring form on my desk during the day, that would be embarrassing. They're not going to do that. So we have to either find a more private way to do that or maybe do something different altogether, like check in, check out. And then we also have to have a way, in addition to looking at these entry criteria, to making a plan is when it's time to conclude this or fade it or reduce it because it has been effective, or maybe it's not enough and we need to move on to a tier 3 support. But again, the idea would be we want to have a plan in place for how we can look at multiple sources of data and then use those data to connect kids to supports. So you might think of this yourself as like being able to interact with the data that are already collected in your building as part of regular school practices and being able to say, show me, think about like filtering in Excel, show me the kids in my classroom or in my grade level or in my building who might have tier 2 needs for reading and acting out issues. And then what else should I be looking at? Like things like attendance, like we talked about, like this child, if they were missing 7 days, there's been some great studies done by Hill Walker that have shown it doesn't really matter the reason why kids are absent, But if they're missing more than 10 days a year, then that's going to predict pretty negative outcomes for that student. So like that, I need to address in a different way than the kid who's a regular attender. But we want to have these resources available to you within your tiered, your tiered library to say, here's what we have to offer. And I want to emphasize, you don't need 9 million tier 2 and tier 3 supports. You need ones that work. And so thankfully, due to, the Institute for Education Sciences and What Works Clearinghouse, there's wonderful practice guides and briefs and other resources like those that you'll find on pbis.org and ci3t.org that can help you build a tiered library of research-based practices. And people will often say, can this really be done in high schools and middle schools? And the answer absolutely is the answer. So for example, like let's say you have Read 180 as an option as a tier 2 support, you would have an intervention grid that explains the clarities on that. What do we mean by Read 180? And this is work by Ted Hasselbring, great things to check out if you haven't yet. And then for whom might this be a good idea? And how am I going to know if it's in place, what people think about it, if it's working? Similarly, I might also, this is like one school had this thing, it was like a targeted algebra as a time for kids that were falling below passing in their math classes, because in this district, they could not earn a diploma without passing Algebra 2. So this was available in that building to any 12th grader that had Algebra 2 data that showed that their grades were dropped below 75. They had to have a study hall available, and they had to self-select to want to be there. So if their grade dropped, they had a study hall, they could pop into this, get the extra support, and then head on out. Similarly, the logic is going to be exactly the same at Tier 3. We want to have validated things like John Umbright's functional assessment-based interventions. And incidentally, he has a new book coming out where that whole process is situated within a CI3T model. So you might want to check that out. And that's with him and Jolena Farrow and Carly Opson. But the idea would be, we want to make sure, again, that we have clarities on what is the plan that we are going to, that we're going to do, how we're going to look for kids that need this. And it's not a secret from families and from communities. This is all made transparent in your CI3T implementation manual. And when you're getting ready to do things like this, we want to make sure that we are doing functional assessment-based interventions like at Tier 3 for kids that have the most intensive intervention needs. And thanks to the guidance of the National Center on Intensive Interventions, we also know that we don't have to wait for a kid to go from Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3. They can go directly to Tier 3. But the point would be, we want to make sure that you have access to the resources that you need to implement these validated approaches with fidelity, with accuracy, so that we know that if implemented as planned, you're likely to get that return on your investment in terms of that support. And Brian Cook, Tim Landrum, and Melody Tankersley have done some wonderful work looking at evidence-based practices, what they are, how to find them, et cetera. So we want you to know that the idea in building your system, we're not pulling in what's convenient necessarily. We're pulling in what works that is also relative to your resources, a good possibility that you can do that with accuracy. So at this point, when you're thinking about screening, we are screening all kids. It often comes up where people will say, do I need to screen kids that are receiving special education services? And I say, in all sincerity, you screen every student that's in your building. They're part of your community. So unless that person's getting a paycheck to be there, they are screened. You screen fall, winter, and spring. And we want to make sure that there is indeed that plan for getting started. So when we think about the resources to guide you at this moment, we talked a little bit ago about taking 15 minutes to think about what would you think about building on-site experts and learning some of those low-intensity supports. We'd also like you to consider putting in your calendar when you leave here today, 15 minutes to think about exploring some of these resources on systematic screening. And wherever you are, if you might be in there, picking a tool, picking a process, learning how to install it, we want to make sure that you have guidance on how to do this well. So some of the things that you might want to check out is get information on whatever screening tool you either are using or you're considering using, because you want to make sure that the choice is clear. It's not just of convenience. It's not just the next bright, shiny thing. And at the forefront, you need to ask who you're trying to find. Which kids are you needing to find? For me, finding kids with internalizing issues, I just don't think that can go over. We cannot overstate the importance of looking for that. We want to make sure that you think about internalizing and externalizing and having those being like doing well, like having lower scores in these. Those are the things that are building to more positive well-being for students. So as we're starting to check out some of those resources, let's say you've made a decision on what you're going to use. Then we want to make sure you're checking out what other resources are available to help you use it well, complete it well. And so things like if you were using the SRSSIE, you might choose to check out this web-based browser book where you can click through these pages and find things like protocols, coaching protocols to help set up at the district level so that you know how to build it, how to check it for accuracy, how to have a plan for previews. And then making sure that it doesn't wane, so that make sure that at every time point, we've got the right measure. And many districts will do this particular one where they'll pre-populate students' names and ID numbers about 30 days prior to the opening of the screening date, because that's how long students should be there before the screening takes place. And then we also want day of screening protocol so that when a teacher logs in, they should only have access to the students in their classroom. They should rate. And then they don't have access, ideally, to those item level later. They need the subscale scores to use decision-making. Jennifer Rowland Hagen, Mark Buckman, and Wendy Oakes did a really nice job of using this. And thanks to the generosity of Steve Goodman, a lot of the resources from Michigan were also shared. So like this would be a good place to go check out some of those things about, now that I've made that decision, how do I get in place? How do I use the data? Also, and this is where I'd really love for you to hone in, think about going to pbis.org and clicking on where it says data-based decision-making. And when you click on that, that is going to be the house where you go to find related resources to systematic screening. And not right now, but very soon, we're going to have an opportunity to share with you the final bank of resources that are available, from selecting to installing to using for decision making. So, for example, you will find currently available a resource on how to pick a screening tool, like what should be some of the decisions, like who you want to find, the grade level you want to serve, how much time or what kind of financial resources you have to put in it. And then there's another brief on how to install it. So once I've made that decision, how do I get it into practice? And then importantly, how do I interpret the data? In addition, Rebecca led this wonderful resource about how to communicate with your community about systematic screening, because it is not a secret and we want to be transparent. Like, you want to be able to say, we screen 3 times a year to see how your student's doing academically in terms of, behavioral health. We screen for vision and for hearing, and it's not used to exclude. And I cannot emphasize that enough. We don't want to use these data to exclude. And we want to make sure that, like, if you are doing things like if you've decided to have a student completed measure or a family completed measure, we also want to communicate with them what their plans are if they want to opt out so that it's not considered. And we want to make sure you have a plan that, if you're going to do screenings completed by other people, we have to have a way to respond. If you're doing teacher completed screenings, remember, teachers are mandated reporter. If they had suspected that that child was a risk to themselves or others, they would have already had to report that. But if you're gleaning new information from new raters like students and families, there has to be a mechanism for checking so that if there is those risks that need to be addressed immediately, that those are done. And so we want whatever the decisions are around screening to be communicated with your families in your community. In addition, we have another resource that is also available about, the hows and whys of systematic screening and addressing frequently asked screening tools. And when you click on that, you just download it and you'll see an image of exactly what it looks like to your right. Rebecca and I are in the final stages with the last resources that will be coming out. Those that are currently available are those that we're showing you now. Like, for example, we often will get people that reach back and say, can you tell me a little bit about like what you've learned from other people's screening, or give me some information about, practitioners. And here's an example of a resource that actually details lessons learned from practitioners. That kind of walks through their journey of how do they select it? How do they install it? What are they doing? So this might be, a quick guide, a couple of pages for you to check out. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, our hope today is that you'll think about what you've built, what you have available, and start to build your capacity in being ready to use those screening data. And then spend another 15 minutes following today's webinar to check out these resources. And there's things that are available to you at each of these stages. But our goal in asking you to log into pbis.org is to check out these resources and share them widely. Screening is not a secret. I think screening is an actual gift in the sense that screenings allow you to get that image of what's happening at Tier 1, empowering teachers, connecting students to supports. And then in terms of your own professional learning, after you've checked out those briefs, if you want to connect some more, you're also welcome to join us. We host Project Empower sessions 6 times a year. These are all free access. You're welcome to join us if you'd like. Actually, I think we have one coming up a little bit later this academic year, but these get updated each year. You're welcome to sign up for those if you want to come learn more about how systematic screening works in tiered systems. We also offer monthly just drop-in CI3T trainers and coaches calls. We have a lot of people that drop in specifically to ask questions about systematic screening. These sessions are not recorded, whereas the Empower sessions are recorded. If into those, these are just places that are, this is run by Grant Allen out of University of Wisconsin Stout. And the point of these is just to have a safe space to drop in to ask questions. It's not recorded, but please do feel free to drop in if you have any questions, and be on the lookout for some new things coming out on social media as we're sharing our lessons learned. But we truly just want to thank you very much for your commitment. Rebecca and I have a strong passion, along with other members of our team, about looking for students at the first kind of concern. And in front of that, making sure that we're gleaning information so that we can better understand the system. Because we want to make sure that screening data are first used to check out the happening of what's happening at Tier 1 practices. Because we know that this information, when used well, can actually predict how kids will perform over time. But if you're screening at the beginning, like if you have more than 20% of your kids that have higher than average internalizing issues or higher than average externalizing issues, that is not the time to start connecting kids to 42% of your kids to all these extra support. That is the time to focus on Tier 1 efforts. So we hope that you will screen responsibly. Make sure that all students are screened. It's communicated with your families within your community. And again, before you screen, have a plan to intervene. And that plan begins with Tier 1. So thank you very much for your commitment to meeting students' multiple needs in an integrated way. If you have any questions or would like to follow up, we'd love to hear from you. Our email addresses are at the bottom of that screen. And in the meantime, we wish you a wonderful end to your day. We hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we'd like to give a thanks and a shout out to the National Center on PBIS. Enjoy your day.